Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. This is Sudeep Sen.
This is Fiona Sampson.
And welcome to our second season, episode 5. And we have three brilliant writers. I mean, it's just one of those things that sometimes accidentally the planets eclipse in a particular alignment. And we have three brilliant writers, Nathalie Handal from Palestine, who also divides her time between New York and Abu Dhabi, Cassandra Atherton from Australia, and she's very kindly stayed up. It's 3 a.m. there, so that's fabulous. And Lorna Goodison from Jamaica and Canada, she'll be joining us later. Hopefully, she's probably misread the time and it could be the time difference. So welcome all of you. And yes, as I said, please use the chat box generously. I've already put up the bios there, but I will formally, of course, read it out before we begin. Fiona, do you have anything to say?
I would like to join you in welcoming everybody, Sudeep, to what I know is going to be another really exciting and kind of inspiring, old-fashioned word, but who cares, and generally engaging session of Conclave. Three astonishing women poets from three very different traditions, speaking, as it were, to each other as well as to all of us. Thank you all three for joining us. If you do, Lorna, but thank you, Cassandra and Nathalie. Welcome.
Yeah. So Cassandra, we'll start with Cassandra. Cassandra, I'll read out your bio properly. Cassandra Atherton is widely anthologized and an award-winning prose poet and scholar of prose poetry. She was a Harvard visiting scholar in English and a visiting fellow at Sophia University. She co-authored Prose Poetry and Introduction, published by Princeton University Press in 2020, and co-edited the Anthology of Australian Prose Poetry, Melbourne University Press, also 2020, with Paul Hetherington, who was on our show and was a brilliant session. She is also a commissioning editor for Westerly Magazine, associate editor for Mad Hat Press in the US, and professor of writing and literature at Deakin University. Cassandra, a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a real honor. It's a wonderful series, so I'm delighted that you invited me. Thank you. So I will begin. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I have a few different kinds of prose poetry. I tried to range over a kind of different series of themes. So I'm going to begin with a prose poem called Bonds. You wore a white Bonds t-shirt to bed last night, a plain white, no nonsense Bonds t-shirt, and I knew it was over. I heard the death knell. And when you asked me if I was Emily Dickinson's ear, I nodded, solitary, solitaire, solipsist. For whom does the bell toll, you asked that afternoon? Campanologists? To in Campania? Campaniles? It tolls for thee. R.I.P. my lover. R.I.P. my Van Winkle. Rip out my heart, wrap it in your white t-shirt and bury it beneath your floorboards, still beating, my little drummer boy. You can beat me, but I won't be your fiendish queen, my butcher. My blood on your t-shirt will form a scarlet letter. Spot, out, damn spot. You wore a white t-shirt to bed last night when all I wanted was to be stuck to your back, when all I asked was to peel myself off you in the morning and mount your erect compass needle. But now we are done, and you peel me like a grape. I slither out of my skin, Skinner, skin me alive. I thought we were conjoined, destined to travel in circles until we met again in the middle, until we found our core. But like Nabokov's apples, all you manage to achieve is to tempt me with repetition. When I am only your dystopian Eve. There can be no valedictions here, so now our lives are cotton. And although cotton breathes, it is also the sarcophagus of our relationship, embalmed memories. But I promise to dig you up, like Heathcliff or Rossetti. I promise to unbind you and gather you in my arms, skin on skin, My sweat will be our glue as I rip off that t-shirt and bond you to me one last time.
Whoa. Literally, yeah, it's just fantastic, I think. Yeah.
Thanks. I kind of like to use a lot of intertextuality because I think in prose poems it kind of squashes them even more nicely against one another and around one another. So yeah. The next poem is called Plum. William Carlos Williams was a genius, and he has my lover's initials, or rather, my lover has his initials. I often eat the plums that were in the fridge, but I don't expect to be forgiven. Not everything depends upon that, or the wheelbarrow of promises that still lies at the bottom of his heart. That's just a vain hope. My lover likes plums, the ones with the tough skins and the scarlet flesh, not the yellow. We like the same food, except for chops. I won't eat lambs to the slaughter. Once I was called a goo-goo-eyed vegetarian, which basically means I won't eat anything cute with big imploring eyes because it would be almost like eating myself. Baby cows are cute, pigs are cute, and lambs are definitely cute. Even mutton dressed as lamb, so they're all out. But I eat chicken and fish and sometimes beef if it isn't veal. He lived on a farm once, so he hates sheep. He tells me that sheep are the stupidest animals ever. They deserve to be eaten. He even tells me the story about how sheep follow each other in straight lines and that the earth becomes shiny and solid beneath their feet. And he and his brothers would ride along their little tracks on their bikes, red bikes, like the wheelbarrow in his faulty heart. One day, he might even grow me some plums so that I can pick them and put them in our fridge. I want a red Smeg 473-litre fridge. I want my whole kitchen to be red. He draws the line at a red fridge. He's never heard of Smeg, Smeagol, Smorg the dragon. He doesn't believe in the nuance of sound. He doesn't understand the importance of a big, red, expensive fridge. He thinks they are just for keeping things cold, like plums. Some of the next poems are ekphrastic poems, prose poems, and sort of based on my obsession with the Pre-Raphaelites. So Pre-Raphaelite. I wish I had been painted by Millet, maybe not as Ophelia in a tepid bath, perhaps as Lady Macbeth or Titania or Portia. I used to make you sit on a little wooden stool and pretend you were painting me, stroke after stroke rasping against the canvas. I would unravel my strawberry plaits and stare at you, sherry eyes, corsage at my neck, picking up the small crumbs of wedding cake and passing them through my gold ring 9 times. But you still didn't get the hint, and so I'm suspended in that moment, forever bridesmaid. I can't be Effie to your Ruskin, so blot out the canvas with grey. Euphemia's hagiography turns on a wheel and a bear, but I can't be your martyr. Writhing in my skin, I call out to Rossetti to paint me. I make you call me Guggums and cling to wild heartsease. We both know the laudanum comes later. So you paint me Regina Cordium, hooded lids, heart-shaped pendant. There are 2 still babies in the shadows, one within and one without. Broken-hearted I become your posthumous Beatrice. Dig me up, Dante. Exhume me, consume me, shift the soil between us and gather me in your arms. Chase your journal of poems around my coffin with your fingertips as you hold me. Let me hear your mew of pleasure when you have it at last. My copper hair fills the empty space, but the worm's hole in your journal eats away at your heart. Beata Beatrix. If you elegize me, do it slowly. Don't write a pantoum one evening over a chicken curry or a villanelle on a train between suburban stations. Take your time. Compose a prose poem longhand in a notebook with a fountain pen. Buy an inkwell and fill it with pink ink. Let it stain your writing fingers. Set aside a few nights each month to put in commas and take out adjectives. Picture me in every metonym and alliteration. Imagine us inhabiting the spaces between words. When it's finished, don't publish it. Make a bonfire and watch the paper catch and burn, the letters taking off like hundreds of fireflies in the starless night. Proserpine. There is freedom in summer, in blue heaven slurpees and alfresco dining. My lover throws the sheet from his body and the sun stripes his legs like bright stockings. Sometimes we open the window and the breeze is jasmine in the morning, burning citronella candles in the evening. One time he suggested we go to Bath in June to prolong our season, drink champagne with chili mussels and look out over rooftops from an apartment with a turquoise door. But I promised to spend winter with someone else, drinking hot chocolate with marshmallows, burrowing beneath the king-size doona. When blossom starts to creep across branches, a book arrives in the mail with 6 pomegranate seeds pressed between the pages. And then I have some prose poems that I like to write sort of about dissection and flesh, and also continue with my kind of intertext. So these two are called Faulkner and Block. My mother is a fish. I have buried her 3 times already, but the water table is high and she floats to the surface. I cleaned her using scissors to cut through the bones attached to her pelvic fins, but I can't cross the river while her cloudy eyes are directed at the sky. The tackle box is full of the rusty hooks of untried catches. I take a pitted sinker and use the fishing line to weigh down her fleshy isthmus. There is water in my shoes, but I can feel the stones rise beneath my feet. Block. I unmake my point shoes, unpicking the past from their skin, burning the frayed edges. They come apart with coaxing, my blade filleting the shank like I'm easing flesh from a fish's backbone. Heel on heel, I cup the toe box in my left hand, pressing down with my right. In the stiff resistance, I find memory, nights backed in silver where we breathed our stasis and exhaled regret. In the soft release, I mark the arch and 3/4 the shank. When I peel the onion of the toe, it's like the ribbon layers of my epidermis being stripped away. This poem was specifically written for a trip to Japan and was translated into Japanese. So it's a little more playful. It's called Watermelon. After 85 days, I gave birth to a watermelon. It wasn't easy. A full-term Jubilee watermelon is 40 pounds, and this one was delivered breech. When my water broke, it pooled on the floorboards beneath my bare feet. You didn't realize it would travel under the wood and warp the grain. You'd only find that out the following day when you brought the watermelon home. You could feel the edges of the board curving under your toes. By the time you got me to the hospital, I was dilated 10 centimeters, and the nurse said it was too late for an epidural. But the melon's rind was slick and helped me squeeze it down the birth canal. When I finally pushed it out, I held it in my arms, stroking the skin. It's perfect, you said, sniffing its head. Smells so sweet. It takes a while to stitch me up, so I stay in the hospital while you take the watermelon home. You ring me from the kitchen, swollen boards under your feet, the long-bladed knife in your hand. Next time, let's try for a cantaloupe, you say. So the last poems I'm going to read are a short sequence that I was asked to write on the idea of heroes. And I wanted to look at heroines rather than heroes, or heroes that were women rather than instead of having separate words for them. And so there was a wonderful place that I used to hang out in Hiroshima, and it was called the Hiroshima Diner, and it was spelt hero at the beginning and Shima as a play on words. And so I constructed it. I had to write 21 prose poems, and I'm not going to read all 21, but I'm going to read the beginning of the sequence. And it's sort of about a poet going into the diner and seeing the photographs of atomic bomb survivors and being asked to write a poem for a meal in the diner. And so I'm going to finish with this short sequence. Hiroshima Diner, Keiko Agura. When Keiko Agura invited me to step into the atomic space, I hesitated. I wasn't 2.4 kilometers from the hypercenter. I wasn't alone on the north side of the road. I didn't see Hiroshima as a sea of fire. I am not Habaksha. This is not my story to tell. The nuclear sublime, the atomic sublime, these are euphemisms for the unnameable. I told Keiko I couldn't imagine it. She nodded and taught me to make a paper crane. I folded the paper, turning it over, but couldn't work out how to make the pocket. Keiko put her hands over my fingers and pressed down the folds. She tugged open the paper pouch. I began to make the wings. The head of a giant pussy willow fills half the diner. Its scarred trunk winds up through the floor, its branches pushing out through the roof as if a giant needle has stitched the diner into the sky. A man in a Carp baseball cap says, Hibakujuma, survivor tree, and the chef gestures toward 10 black and white photographs of women on the wall. A meal for a poem, she says. Okonomiyaki. I order okonomiyaki, bonito flakes, perform tai chi atop layered noodles and fried egg, the paper-thin sheaves of fish waving and curling. One of the regulars asks me my name before writing it neatly in Japanese with a thick-nibbed fountain pen on a slip of paper. Bright, she says, pointing to one of her written characters. I point to another. Cherry blossom. Sakura, I say. She smiles and nods. I cut along the lattice of mayonnaise and see the layers of cabbage and noodles suspended in the pancake matrix. It reminds me of a hot evening in Narita where I ordered cheesy teppanyaki noodles and you drank asahi from a frosted stein. The chef places a box of okonomiyaki on the counter, Mutsumi Un Nursing Home written on the side in bright cherry blossom style. I take out my notebook and pen. For the lonely, she says. In one blinding flash, she is unmarriageable, with shiny beetroot skin and gnarled paper palm hands. For a month, her mother smooths her skin with cooking oil before peeling remnants of cloth and fragments of ash-colored flesh from her body. She is called Devil's Claw Marks, A-bomb maiden, and shame. She suggests a twilight society for disfigured women. The Reverend calls them calloid girls. In America, her chin is fetishized in photos as the stump of a candle that has melted down below the wick. A dozen operations and skin grafts rebuild her face. Even after she marries and bears a son, she is called Hiroshima Maiden. The chef serves it in a flower-shaped bowl, naked and bathing in dashi. I imagine it clothed in its shell, soaking in a hot spring. My onsen egg is half boiled and in reverse, firm yolk and runny white. It's like a giant eyeball plucked from the Cyclops' forehead. The gelatinous white is soft custard on my tongue, and I remember the undercooked omelettes you ate at the breakfast buffet, bright orange yolks spotting your plate. At 8 p.m, one of the regulars takes a cuff and stethoscope out of her bag. Some won't go to the doctor, so Hina created nurse's station night, the chef tells me. I squeeze the yolk with my chopsticks and wonder how many patrons she saved. The yellow sphere is shiny like a lacquered sun. And the last one is Sadako Kurihara, one of my favorite poets, atomic bomb poets. She was 4 kilometers north of the epicenter. She writes about it, but censorship destroys her lines with thick black boxes and overscoring. Her notebooks from high school are filled with haiku. Now new poems rupture traditional forms. The blank page is ground zero. She sees beyond its edges and past Hiroshima. Her testimony burns. She is midwife at the birth of the atomic bomb. Her pen is heavy. In free verse, she reminds us all, we are sitting on black eggs. So thank you for having me and listening. I appreciate you coming and being invited.
Oh, wow. Marvelous, marvelous. I mean, they're so dense. Of course, you know, some of us had the pleasure of reading these poems before. I've read some of your books before. One thing that strikes me about your prose poetry, apart from the density of literary allusion and fabulously tight use of language, is your reliance on the use of consonants over assonants in your prose poems. Something maybe you haven't noticed, but when I've been reading your work, that's the tonality of that particular bass sounds hit my ear. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I do. I have sort of noticed that. I think it actually comes from childhood, and I think that there's something quite lovely about those sorts of almost nursery rhyme kind of approaches where you have ways of memorizing things, and they all begin, with the letter C, or they all begin with the letter S, or those sorts of things. It may also be because I have terrible flat vowel sounds, and so assonance is not great for an Australian girl. But no, there's something I think that's quite appealing about the repetition of sound, and I think that often comes, with certain consonants as well. I know I favor some consonants over others as well. So yeah, I think it's a childhood thing.
Thank you.
I think the things that was incredibly impressive about your reading was the way the stakes kind of grew and grew. And it made me wonder whether, paying such attention to another culture and another culture's tragedies, does that feel more like, and this is reductive, but does it feel more like the intertextuality you've done is a sort of built the muscle for that, or is it more like the ekphrasis that you've done built the muscle for that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I think that I've always been worried about appropriation. So sort of building to the idea of someone else's story. And then there was this wonderful moment when I went to, which wouldn't sound like a wonderful moment, but I went to the atomic bomb ceremony in Hiroshima 5 years ago, and I met with a number of Hibakusha, and they all said, you have to write about it because we're going to lose the understanding of it. And Keiko Agura actually said to me, it's only writers and painters who have imagination, and imagination is the key to remembering the tragedy that happened and sort of keep telling the story. And it made me feel a little bit more like I did have something to say, provided I wasn't saying that it was my story, but I felt like I was kind of lobbying for kind of, anti-nuclear kind of stance, and that sort of opened a door for me, I suppose, to do that. But certainly reading a lot of newspapers and speaking to people and having interviews, and that intertextuality that you were talking about is given me, I think, the skill to interweave them so that I felt like they were still poetry. I think that can be hard sometimes when you see poetic biography, that it can't just be a biography, it has to be poetry. And I've seen people struggle with that. And so I didn't want to be overly, sort of biographical or factual. I wanted to use the facts in a poetic way. And I learned Mariko Nagai has written a wonderful book called Irradiated Cities, which is prose poetry. She uses colons quite a lot to punctuate the whole way through. And she also has photographs. And she has talked quite a lot about the sources that she's read and the archives she's been to, and the similar kind of situation. She doesn't read or write Japanese, and she grew up in Europe, but still felt compelled to tell the story.
I thought one of the things that was very impressive is that you were really scrupulous about saying that, sort of positioning yourself in relation. And I think actually scrupulousness is quite a hard thing to work into poetry.
Yeah, I think it's important though. I think too, because things can be taken out of sequences, and you can always have a disclaimer up the front, but it doesn't always make its way into other anthologies or into other settings. So yeah, I wanted to keep drawing my attention back to that idea.
Before we forget, do put the link of the person you just mentioned, the book you mentioned. That'll be very
I will, Mariko Nagai. Yeah, I can do that.
When you have a moment. But Sash Trevitt makes a comment that the first Diana poem dealt with appropriation so beautifully. Now, the word appropriation is actually very, very telling, because there are various kinds of appropriations you're doing, literary, sonically, culturally, and so on. Do you want to expand on that? Because I think it's a very important point.
Yeah, I think that the word appropriation has become charged with the idea of telling someone else's story. But of course, as you say, really, beautifully, there are so many appropriations that don't necessarily have that relatively negative context. You can appropriate for the joy of something, you can hear something and want to kind of reproduce it. One of the things that I felt that I was using to my advantage was the idea of sound, and wanting to somehow use the understanding I had about sound and the atomic bomb by putting it into my work. That combination of silence with this kind of rupturing. And I also wanted to do that in the form of prose poetry. So when after the atomic bomb, a lot of Japanese poets started writing free verse for the first time because they felt that the old ways of writing haiku and the old kind of forms that had, they had loved and had been so traditional could never be returned to, because you can't go back to what has happened, after you have something like an atomic bomb. And so I sort of wanted to look at that within the prose poetry box as well. So kind of appropriating a whole lot of ideas that weren't necessarily, the more negative ones we think of taking someone's story away from them, but just kind of learning from their stories and using parts that I feel I have access to as a poet and reproducing those.
So you're talking about rupture, right? Rupture, but in your the visual quality of your poetry is anti-rupture because they're in very neat rectangles.
But what happens when you squeeze them? The idea is when you look at it, they're squeezed, and at any point they can burst into the white space around them.
And well put. And what happens, like, when you sent me your poems, it had very fixed margins.
Yeah.
Of course, when I'm trying to print it out, depending on the printer and the font, it accommodates more words on the same line. Is that something that you want or do not want, or are you flexible about it? Because it's so important, because you're obviously carefully crafting each line and depending on the margin.
I think as a prose poet, you have to give that away. I think I started off actually making perfect prose poetry box, like I would fiddle until they actually fitted in this perfect box, and I wanted words under one another and all of that. And I did that for a number of years. And then I learnt from other prose poets, and largely from journal layout. They're like, we can't do it like that. Prose poets don't care about that. And so I think there's a lot of freedom in giving that part of a prose poem over and saying it should work. It shouldn't have a line ending. So it should have sentences that wrap at the margin, and it really shouldn't matter where they wrap. So yeah, there's liberation in it. I think it takes a while maybe to get used to it, especially if you're a poet who's written verse, that they're so important, the line endings, and then you have to kind of realize that every journal. I've had prose poems published in 3 different anthologies, and they appear entirely differently, and I think you just have to give yourself over to that and and realize that that's kind of part of its freedom.
And so talking of structure, beyond the individual prose poem, thinking about the sequence of 21 prose poems, not a hero's journey, but it's an overarching structure to that sequence?
Yeah, I hadn't done that before.
Auditory or yeah,
sorry, go.
Well, is it auditory or is it led by meaning, or what's your strategy?
I wanted to experiment with narrative. So I think prose poetry has small parts and fragments of narrative. And one of the things I like about prose poetry compared to something like flash fiction is it has a very circular idea. It keeps coming back to the same ideas all the time. And the endings are supposed to be quite different from flash fiction too. So I wanted to look at endings when you have a sequence, and what happens to endings in prose poems when they become not the only one on the page. And then I also sort of wanted to experiment with the idea of getting a narrative in there without it overtaking the poetry. And so there were sort of things that I was experimenting with when I was, writing that sequence.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Really, another round of applause.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant, brilliant. I mean, we can go on and on. These discussions are fantastic, but we will pick up on this idea because it's not talked about very often, a difference between flash fiction and prose poetry, because you did separate them out, and not often that is easy to kind of quantify. But we'll pick up that because many of Lorna's poems, surprisingly for me, because I've read her poetry and they're more sort of poem looking, but she sent a whole stack of prose poems to read. But if she reads, then we'll talk about that. Thank you, Cassandra, again.
Thank you, Cassandra. And now we welcome Nathalie.
Yes. So Nathalie is, I don't know where she's sitting, but I love her bookscape. So it may be Abu Dhabi, which is where she now currently teaches, but she otherwise lives in New York. And her bio, my goodness me, it's It's the United Colors of Benetton, really. But I'll just read part of it. Let me just put the whole thing up on the side so that you can see the whole thing. Just a moment.
I think it's here. I can see it in the chat.
Yeah, good, good. So Nathalie Handal was raised in Latin America, France, and the Middle East, and educated in the United States, United Kingdom, and Asia. Her poetry books include Life in a Country Album, The Republics, Love and Strange Horses, and more. She's won many, many awards. You can see it on the sidebar. So many that it's impossible to pronounce them. She's the author of 8 plays, editor of 2 brilliant anthologies, both of them I have in Delhi, and a flash essays and creative nonfiction have appeared in the Vanity Fair, Guernica magazine, The Guardian, New York Times, The Nation, Irish Times, amongst others. She's currently an associate professor of practice in literature and creative writing at New York University, the Abu Dhabi branch, and does this brilliant column, travel column for Words Without Borders, which is an online international magazine which you must see. And her series, a column, is called The City and the Writer. Nathalie, from wherever you are, a very, very warm welcome. Shalom.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sudeep. Thank you, Fiona. Salam to you too. And Cassandra, thank you for that beautiful reading. My mother is a fish. Wow, I love it. Thank you so much. Tonight, I'm gonna read love poems. During this time, during COVID, which continues, I was reflecting a lot on love. Are we in a loveless world? What is this love? You know, talking about love, sometimes you feel like you bring it up and people even have contempt for that word. And I go back to Bell Hooks, and I want to open this evening with a quote from her. She writes, "I feel our nation," and I could say the world, I can add the world, is turning away from love, moving into a wilderness of spirit so intense, we may never find our way home again. I write of love to bear witness both in the danger in this movement and to call for a return to love. We yearn to end the lovelessness that is so pervasive in our society. There can be no love without justice. Love is an action. And this, of course, I come from a deeply rooted family from Bethlehem. And as a Bethlehemite, if you fall in love with a Jerusalemite, although Jerusalem and Bethlehem were always sister cities, you cannot be together because a Bethlehemite cannot go live in Jerusalem, and a Jerusalemite would lose his or her ID if they came to Bethlehem. So love is occupied. And this first poem speaks of this. In Search of Midnight. He kissed my lips at midnight. I let him. He took my blouse off. I let him. Took my bra off and touched my breast. I let him. He took my pants off. I let him. Took my underwear off and looked at me standing in this strange, dark, black and white room. I let him. A small light dim by the window, I took a glimpse of the city we live in. Both do not know. Then he pronounced my name wrong and I stopped him. Asked him if he has ever been exiled or imprisoned. If he has ever mailed letters to a woman he once loved but would never see again. If he thinks we can go back to a lover even if we might not love the second time. Asked him if he has ever robbed a small grocery store or stole bread from a peasant. If he has ever crossed seas, coasts, mountains, and still could not arrive. He answered, I did not pronounce my name correctly in my country, so I was tortured. I did not pronounce my name correctly at the enemy line, so I was exiled. I did not pronounce my name correctly upon arrival, so I was given new papers. You see, a heart in search of midnight is only a heart. Everything else is the same, except what the other is expecting.
Mm. Wow.
Even in love. I try to tell you there isn't a part of you missing, that even if war has damaged you, I want to be close to your wound. It's your heart that undresses me when you can't touch me. It's your noise that blows open my darkness. And maybe I ask, but never ask you. The hole you fell into is nothing. It's what remains around it that matters. But even in love, war inhabits me. This next poem, my last book, Life in a Country album, I wanted to revisit the empires. Being French and being American, and I was also thinking of what those places taught me in relationship to love. And this poem takes place in France. It's entitled Killing Me Softly. I left him after we saw a film by Michel Leclerc. I didn't want to kiss him anymore. He was no longer buoyant like the painting I bought from a Senegalese artist in Chinatown. The 13th arrondissement will no longer be where I go for desire. Before I left, I told him I'd keep the J'adore l'Algérie poster because he resented it. Maybe it was time we admitted that no one is happy in Paris. That's why we never leave. The truth is, we stopped listening way before we stopped kissing, like those who lead us. And this one takes place in the States, and really it speaks about how exile is merciless. As I watched some of my cousins go to war. Midnight train to Georgia. My cousin, the army captain, didn't say much. Then one day he wrote to her, "Didn't I adore you harder than silence? Didn't you know I kept trying to reach you, but kept appearing on the other side of wherever you were, wherever I was? Didn't you know I tore time into pieces to understand how I harmed you? Kiss me one last time. Who can really escape the heart well enough not to leave a trace? Kiss me one last time. Didn't you know I was afraid to count the music on your side of midnight, to count the steps that would never lead me to where I could tell you, free me." This next poem is entitled Shura Hayat, and it has a Persian Arabic. It's Persian and Arabic together. Shur is a musical system that means ecstasy, vitality, passion, revolution. And Hayat means life in both languages. Not the city noise, nor the mythic clouds will let us know what the night means. Not the waters we confess, nor our lips in euphoria, or our intertwined bodies will explain where we are and why. Maybe years later, we discover we needed evidence of ourselves and each other. Or maybe we find all that exists is what we've built inside. Now, when you come to mind, I think you decided not to love elsewhere, and I to keep traces of you all over my body, as if a map of an ideal world. And this last poem I'm going to read, I have a chapbook coming out called Volo, which is in Latin to fly, and it's also a wish. And one of the poems entitled Voyages was included in American Poets Write About the Pandemic, which was published by Knopf. And this poem was inspired, is a conversation with Joy Harjo, our wonderful poet laureate. And it really, when we think of love, we also, of course, think of death. And during this moment, this is an offering. Voyages. Shut off the music, the lights, close the window and travel. Let your body gather voices as if they're flowers in an infinite garden. Thank your spirit for the flight. Thank the earth for the echoes and empathy, for emptying your fears of time past. Be certain of your direction. Your heart knows the road, the one with needles under your feet that feels less painful than all the dying around, the one that is made of water, where floating is a long and short breath. And be kind to the healing earth. Don't be tempted by its roars, which are its pains. Let the ache out. Gather all your selves, angel and bird, ancestor and bark. Gather your wanderings so you can rest for a while, then awake to help those who didn't make it back. Thank you so much.
Brilliant.
Oh, my heart really sank when you said this was my last poem. I wanted more. And one doesn't often say that in a poetry reading.
Thank you
It's
so
just
much.
absolutely, the kind of poetry that makes the hair stand up on your necks, just kind of, transformative, symbolic. Yeah, just, this is what poetry is for, isn't it? This kind of voyage into the higher stakes, but with this kind of scrupulousness with your imagery, with the symbol. It's not arbitrary. It's so powerful because it's so exactly chosen. I mean, your first poem starts off so innocently. Well, it's not innocent, it's very sexy, but innocently, and then look where it takes us into the suffering of brutal exile. And just thank you so much, Nathalie.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you for
Yeah,
How did you, can I ask how you chose that set of poems? Sorry, Sudeep.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
you mean the whole series? I was just thinking about the different places that I was in conversation with love. And of course, we're always in conversation with love, right? But I felt that there was something so distinct about my relationship to everything from love to the erotic, because of course, eroticism is also a form of resistance, right? So, and so I started with Palestine because, all my life I was separated from absolutely everyone I loved. I mean, this poem was sort of an intimate reflection of two lovers, but in fact, everyone in my life, until now, we're separated from. And some of us who have, passports to travel are the only ones that can go to those people. But gathering together a family that's so dispossessed is really difficult. And that really, you have really a lot of conversations with what is love in relationship to society. Where do we begin? What does it mean exactly? These are just, it's the fundamental, and yet that has been stripped away from you. And then, of course, going to France, where, there was, my 20s in France was sort of sensual and, sort of discovering myself in that way, but also extremely political, as you can see from the poem. And you know, making sort of in conversation with the body, you know, what is love? You know, as a young girl, you have these ideas of love, but your body might be telling you something completely different, right? And in America, of course, in the United States, I might have cousins that ended up in Georgia. And this is the South, you know, I'm from New York, but the South is something completely different, that landscape. And you know, it's just everything from even also in relationship to God, because, you know, Christianity, the evangelist, and I come from Bethlehem, you know, this is where Jesus is born. So there's a lot going on there. And of course, there's a few other poems here and there. And at the end, it's about this gathering of us coming together as a world during this moment. Will we come together to hold each other's hands during this moment, which we collectively experience together? You know?
And collectively experience into, in a sense, all these different, sorry about the noise my dog is making, by the way, are these, absolutely ignoring it, but it must be distracting for you. Don't
hear it.
It's kind of coming together through, you know, kind of French rationalism, the French idea of the citizen self, the American idea of the self, the idea of the self as it's imposed or constellated if you come from Bethlehem. I mean, managing to draw those selves and those ways of understanding together, well, it must be a life's work, but I mean, it's so deeply infuses, you know, that kind of, it, you know, it layers in your work, doesn't it?
Yeah, also just to follow up on that, you know, to add to what Fiona is saying, the layering gets even more textured by Arabic poetry, the musicality of the spirituality, what is sacred and profane in these cultures. You know, we recognize this because they're completely polar opposites in many ways, but it's through the music of poetry and lyricism, erotica, that often it's gathered together. You use the word gathering. So that's such a central trope in your writing. And you do that obviously because part of it is to make sense of your life and the lives of the people you love. The other, of course, is this is the only space we have really to do it through language. So when we're talking about language, how language is currently speaking, you know, so politicized and taken away from the center, so to speak. Where do you stand on that? Because at one level, the kind of poetry you write will be very, very profane for certain parts of America. South certainly is. At the same time, it's so beautifully spiritual to me. I mean, the first poem tells us that, and so many other poems do too. So tell us about this beautiful, you know, the cusp of erotica and spirituality, because these are very distinct things in your writing.
Yeah, well, I'll fast forward from the beginning where I'll rewind from when you spoke about this gathering. I think I've always seen separations. You know, what I've seen was borders, separation, people talking about differences. And then I had poetry, and this poetry taught me about commonalities. And it was such a generous space. And I had much more faith in what it was giving to me than all that separation. And so I was always, in all my books really, search for these commonalities, not to eliminate the differences and so forth, but to really go back to what poetry, I think, teaches us, right? Which is that gathering. And also when it comes to language, that also was taken away from me, because as a young girl who, you know, wanted to be a poet, but who did not really have a native tongue, I mean, I could possibly say that French was my first language. It was the closest thing, but in reality, my language is a symphony of languages. I came from 5 or 6 languages, and I heard those languages at home, and those languages were mixed together, and we would sit in our family, everybody would be speaking a different language, and we would just respond in the language we felt most comfortable in. And that really is the natural, my mind, and even when I write, it naturally, this is what I hear, and that is my language. Of course, 20 years of writing has, I've sculpted sort of all of this into my American English, which culturally this American English has allowed me to bring in all these other places, I would say, because I didn't feel that in French, for example, I could do that, or in Spanish. And actually tonight I didn't read some of the Latin American inspired love poems. And so yeah, and then what did you ask me after? I lost track. And about what do I think about how language?
No, the sacred and the profane.
Oh yes, and which leads me to that. That's a great question. I thought there were moments in the beginning where I would have censored myself or stopped myself from reading something, and of course, out of respect in certain spaces, I understand, out of respect, you would do that. But I do remember once, I think I was in California, and I read a very erotic poem. And there was an Arab woman, a Muslim woman, who came up to me after. She goes, but you know that poem, the one with the bra, very good. And she walked away. And I thought, that was an interesting moment, which is that sometimes there are things that we want to engage with. I have to remember that all these poems it might make some people angry, but it might also reach others in ways that are so fundamental, right? We can't always win. So I sort of, there's a balance for me when I perform which poems I'm going to perform and taking the audience into account. But as a writer myself, I allow myself to go where I need to go. I don't stop myself. I might have earlier on, but not anymore.
Yeah.
And of course, one wonderful side effect of this this multiplicity of languages that you come from and you live with is that actually your poems have those incredibly good bones. I mean, they're incredibly translatable. I mean, because they are not, as Jan Kaplinski once said to me, language bound. They are idea-led. It's not that they're not musical and beautiful, but you could now, someone could translate them into French. Maybe you couldn't have that thought in French, but someone could translate them into whatever, and they would sing. Not a lot would be lost. And that's I think that's a sort of one way to think about the enduringness of a poem, isn't it? That portability.
Yeah, great. Yes, that's true, very much.
John Elliott asks, Nathalie, do you write in other languages?
Actually, John, thank you for your question. I can write in other languages, but honestly, the poems came in English, and I welcomed it because it was when I was young, it was the only thing that wasn't confusing in my life. Everything else was confusing, except that those poems came in English, and I thought, okay, this is it. This, for one reason, I don't know that I really fully understood why they came in English at that time. I think it was about how free I felt in English as opposed to others, because, if you're coming from an Arabic or French or any other Latin language, there's so much more cultural restrictions, I felt. And so that's how it came. And it was wonderful to me. I felt free in every way. And I was still able, my poetry infuses a lot of those language and the musicality of those languages within my English, and even my prose work. And just for example, I have one of my books, Cassandra read prose poems. I have the book prior to Life in a Country album is entitled The Republics. And the Republics really, I called it flash reportage, but they're prose poems. I call it flash nonfiction or reportage because they were loosely based on accounts I heard in Haiti and the Dominican Republic after the earthquake. I had gone there to write a piece on education that the Soros Foundation had asked 10 writers. And then when I got back, I kept hearing all those stories in my mind, and they kept coming out in prose, and then this collection. And it's infused a lot with Haitian Creole, with French and Spanish. I mean, the spirit, I would say the heart of it, the music of those poems are very much etched in those languages, but it's in English.
Mm.
It's very hard not to think about you in relation to Arabic verse, I must say. You know, I think about Adonis or Darwish or whatever when I hear you.
Yeah, well, thank you. Darwish was obviously, he gave me my very first assignment, writing assignment.
Oh, really? Tell
Yep.
us.
And he told me that I had to interview Allen Ginsberg. And I told him I had never interviewed anybody in my life, and it was Mahmoud Darwish asking me for this interview. So of course I did it, and it was, it's a terrible interview looking back. But then Ginsberg died a month later, and I'll never forget. I was with Darwish. We were in the West Bank. We were in Ramallah, and he gave me the newspaper. I was sitting in the back car, and I opened the newspaper, and I said, "Oh my God, Allen Ginsberg just died." So that was my first assignment with him. And it later on, I had no idea at that time. I was living in London, and I had no idea that I was gonna go to New York City, become a New Yorker, become American on the day Barack Obama became president of the United States, all those things. But it also informed my poetics. This just not, I think back at that time when my relationship to Ginsberg and to the language and to the American poetics, I don't know if I fully could access it the way I later came to access this Americanness. And I remember going to Marfa, Texas on a residency, a Lannan Foundation residency, and it's the desert. And obviously coming from the Middle East, I have a relationship with the desert. It's a very spiritual relationship. If you've ever been to the desert, right? You something powerful happens there. And even here, when being in Abu Dhabi, one of the things, it's very modern, but one of the things that remains, it's these sunsets. And it's like red orange, and it just sits on top of the buildings and reminds you of where you are. It tells you, like, despite all of this construction, this is so powerful to see every in the afternoons. And even as I'm talking to all of you, I can see the crescent moon. It's quite amazing. I wish you could all see it. So there's something about I think the music that brings you the Arabic language, and that although here we hear there's a lot of Indians, so you possibly could think like you're in an Indian city as well. So I hear so much Hindi and I mean, there's just, it's very, but still there's this musicality, this East that is very present. And I think my gaze always goes back there, Fiona, and yeah.
Everything starts in the East, as they say.
Sunrises as well.
Very interesting that both poets, both you and Cassandra, have given us sort of stories about entering into a poetic tradition in different ways. I mean, in a sense, you're talking about, the hospitality, Nathalie, of, Darwish, and Cassandra talked about, sort of storming the bastions in a sense of the prose poetry tradition in America, in Australia. And I wonder whether there are different entry points for women.
I think for prose poetry, in Australia, one of the problems, I guess, to women really driving the tradition early on was that their prose poetry was different in theme. It was often more emotional and dealing with more personal issues. And many of the editors of journals in the 60s and 70s in Australia were men who really didn't see that as what prose poetry really was supposed to be about. A lot of the men at the same time were writing satire and a range of things that they felt should be given more space. And so women were writing it, but it wasn't being published until people like Anna Kawani and Anya Volvich and people just kind of started publishing in outback sort of journals that people were putting together, and they got, you know, their own kind of distribution, and they really got things started that way. So that's always really inspiring to me as a woman. Yeah.
But tell us about, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on. I was just going to ask Nathalie who she thinks her precursors are. But sorry, I interrupted.
No, Nathalie, go ahead.
Yeah, who has inspired
Who do you think your precursors are? Do you have a sense of having precursors, or was it too multiple, too hyphenated, too bridge building?
Yeah, it's I can never answer that. I never know how to answer that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Let's bring back the original question of the difference between prose poetry and flash fiction.
Well, I have a pretty big take on this one, to be honest, because prose poetry is poetry and flash fiction is prose fiction, or is written in prose. Prose poetry is written in poetry, even though it uses devices from prose fiction and creative nonfiction. There are a couple of people who've written incredibly compelling things about it. One of them is Carrie Etter, who writes quite a lot on her blog about the differences between the two. Obviously, flash fiction also has many other names like sudden fiction and palm of the hand fiction, all these kinds of terms that are used. Often they go by word length. Flash fiction or sudden fiction or those sorts of ideas, or very short fiction. And Ian Seed has talked about prose poetry and flash fiction by saying that at the end of a piece of flash fiction, you're satisfied. At the end of a piece of prose poetry, you're a dog barking at the moon. And I kind of like that idea. I don't think prose poetry resolves itself in the same way that flash fiction resolves itself. That's not undercutting flash fiction. It just has a different kind of ending.
Can I ask you, Cassandra, because this is very interesting to me, and because I can never, if you were sent a series of 10, you would know how to decide. You would be able to decide which one was what.
I do. Yeah. Look, I think there's probably a couple that, you know, might be somewhere in between, you know, depending on how you read it. Yeah, I do think in 9 out of 10 times, you know, I could pick it. But, you know, there's a lot of other things too. If a poet sends me what they say is prose poetry and I think it's flash fiction, that's fine, because it's not sort of labeled in the journal. It's that I'm kind of choosing it for. So I might send it to the fiction editor instead of keeping it if I think it's flash. But yeah, it's I feel like there are different techniques that are used in flash fiction than prose poetry.
Okay.
Welcome, Lorna.
I am so sorry. We had a windstorm here out on the Sunshine Coast, and everything went down. It's just come back. My apologies.
Not at all. Not at all. We were thinking that maybe you got the time difference wrong by 1 hour.
I was up and ready, all set, and then the wind. Who has seen the wind? I have. It just down.
But you're all right, and your house is all right. You haven't lost bits of. Good, fantastic. Well, it's lovely to have you join us.
Hello, everybody. Hi.
Hi, Lorna. Hi.
So, Lorna, you know the drill. You've been.
Are you happy to read, Phil?
I'm happy to read. Can I still read? Am I allowed?
Yes,
to?
absolutely.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Your entry is so well timed, because I was looking at the clock and I said, okay, let's go over by 10 minutes, because often people join a little late, and you're probably just joining on time, but you don't have to reveal that there was a windstorm. You're perfectly on time at one level.
Okay,
So
so I
Lorna,
have,
please use the chat box, Feely. I've put your bio up there, but I'll read part of it.
it's okay. You don't have to tell them anything about me.
Except that you won every major literary prize in the world. Yes. So Lorna Goodison is a major figure in world literature. She was the Poet Laureate of Jamaica from 2017 to 2020. And in 2019, she was awarded the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry. She's also won the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize for Poetry from Yale University, the Commonwealth Poetry Prize, the Musgrave Gold Medal from Jamaica, the Henry Russell Award, and Canada's largest literary prize, the British Columbia National Award for Canadian Nonfiction from Harvey River, Memoir of My Mother and Her People, which was published in 2007. And this is a must. Her collected poems was published by Coconet in 2017. And if you want to start with Lorna, I think this is a good place to start. It's also a huge door stopper. So it's at least 5 or 6 kilos in weight. Solidly important in terms of words, of course. She's the author of 12 books of poetry, 3 collections of short stories, memoir, a recent collection of essays. She's the professor emerita at the University of Michigan, and now she lives in Half Moon Bay. Beautiful
where
name.
the wind blows.
Yes, British Columbia. Lorna, it's a thrill to have you back. And what a treat, what a treat.
Welcome, Lorna.
Thank you. So I read for 10 minutes? Okay. Mother Muse. Keep doing the island's housekeeping. Scour and rinse out the mouth of a river, plastic scandal bag clogged. You're a pinup girl in a one-piece bathing suit. I saw you sew yourself. It is ruched and tucked like a washboard across your belly. Your wet let-out hair cascades down your back. You dive in and breaststroke the familiar long lap river, rushing past your old childhood home, all but gone to ruin, captured by a pirate cousin. You backstroke, float, and butterfly into Lucy Harbor, where I left you in the Bardo days after death. I'd clung to your capable hand, losing warmth, as we traveled to the western shore. You stepped into the deep and embraced big sea waves, turned back to me on land and said, "You cannot come with me yet." Then off you swam. I set off for home, feet barely touching ground till I reached Constant Spring, where I lifted my eyes to the hills. Go long, you said. I'll be Muse, you be yourself. This is an elegy called Rights. Past the Drumheller Badlands and Sylvan Lake, the shaman came at dawn by way of Red Deer and made for the foothills, where he rattled bones in a bladder pouch, built fire in a smudge pot, and washed her in sweetgrass smoke to no avail. And if special rights could have been transferred for me to become a Blackfoot medicine woman, skilled in the use of puffballs to stem hemorrhage, and the administration of mind-clearing bullberries, beaten off branches just after the fall frost, had I been made honorary blood or pegan dancer in a jingle dress trimmed with copper tinkling cones to sound scatter for crabs, I would have doctored and danced. Instead, I stood by the window and watched her go the way of those great female buffaloes at head smashed in junk. Those matriarchal leaders of herds with wild bangs of coarse black hair and the dowager humps she and I dreaded we'd inherit. We thought we had more time, reads a caption in an exhibition on Plains Indians at the Glenbow Museum. And we thought we had more time. I'll be reading the next couple of poems from Mother Muse, which is my latest book. Sugar. Perfumed by sugar's money musk, our newly refined ancestors took upon themselves airs of Mount Plenty. Aromatic sweet canes render bitter water potable. Canes cultivators, the millions of stolen Africans, counted by Massa as less than, and young Mary was raised not to follow the ways or to consider them playmates, for you and them are not companion. But the girl was alive and quick to the people's music. She shivered her feet to boer drums, sheltered wild notes, escaped from blackbird work gangs, marked converter call to score new beats drummed into barrel staves the one drop way. She made moan to sorrow songs, the belly band of what hard labor breaks. Oh, the dig and plant and weed and cut and juice and boil, blood and toil required for brute cane to achieve sweet mouth, out of which would come our music. The poems in Turn Thanks, many of them are dedicated to a woman called Sister Mary Ignatius, who was a Roman Catholic nun with an abiding love of secular music, who mothered and mentored generations of young Jamaican musicians, who then made modern Jamaican music and music all over the world. And this is a poem called Sister Iggy Thinks of Jessie Ripoll. And Jessie Ripoll was a woman who used her own money to start Alpha, what became this incredible thing called the Alpha Boys School. And it's too long to, you'll have to go look it up. But this is about Sister Ignatius thinking about Jessie Ripoll. This book is really about their odes and praise songs to women who just have taken their own initiative in many instances and done these amazing things. Sister Iggy Thinks of Jessie Ripoll. They say Portugal is lovely this time of year. The roofs are clay red, and Bougainvillea studies new ways to shimmy and cascade across tiles and wide wrought iron balconies, hung over with last night's damp bed linen, on display as sweat-stained tapestries. And the sea is a deep dish, silver with sardines, and long meter waves wash songs of sailors back to shore as mourners, fado mourners. And I think of Creole Jessie Ripoll, who'd heard all her life of lovely Lisboa, city of her fathers, and could have used her inheritance to fill a wicker trunk with picotted linen dresses and set sail like some in-reverse Columbus, landing in Puerto de Lisboa as a lady of substance. Good Jessie, who suffered the little children to come into a place bought with 400 pounds plus 43 acres on South Camp Road, become refuge and safe home for those dispersed stray gangs, offspring of the ex-enslaved, turned loose to wild without fence or friend. Josine Jimenez and Luis de Gaulle, blessed, for joining with Jessie to start up a new world. In the beginning, a cottage with one small orphan girl. This is a poem called Who Knows Where or When. It's a song by that title. And it's about how Don Drummond, the great Jamaican trombonist, may have met Margarita Mahfouz, whom he unfortunately later murdered. But it says, who knows where or when or where, time or date they first met. Romantics believe that it happened one night as he performed with the Scatterlights on stage, and she stood there in the wings in waiting. He sighted her up when he paused, so Dizzy Moore, the trumpeter, could solo. Don lowered his trombone and caught sight of her, standing still in the wings, cool as a marble statue. Waiting in the wings, she'd always go quiet, none around her able to coax response from her save silence. She'd look skyward, slow her heartbeat to near stop, and let the spotlight mark her place. Allow music to build suspense, made the audience wait till she was released from standstill into life again. He saw her at resurrection moment, a stone nymph who before his gaze broke free from becalmed state and with a whirlpool froth of skirts swirled into his melancholy life, she entered aiming for the light. Two last poems. Do I have time for two?
Yes, yes, we do.
This is a poem called Say Something from the English, and it's dedicated to the people of England, the Windrush generation. We all know about the terrible, terrible scandal, but it's dedicated to two women. Paulette Wilson was one of the first people to begin speaking up about this Windrush scandal, and a journalist called Amelia Gentleman, who was just amazing in that she just wouldn't let that story go. Says something from the English. This is what the market women call after her in Mandeville Market. Say something, anything, then say in it. We'll love how you talk sweet. Like how you say, that cocoa, it's a Commander Cocoa, in it. These days, she does not tarry long among the market women. She does not pause at their stalls to run jokes and banter with them about their prices dearer than in Brixton Market. She does not scold how she can buy 3 pounds of yellow yam in England for the price of the one they're trying to sell her. And you blighters grow the yam right here, innit? Go on, they say, you're too mean. Open your English leather purse and release them strong English pounds you have under lockdown. What up, me English? Me think you're gone back by now. Home, her thoughts had floated on the clouds, cushioning the airplane down to soft landing. Home to her kitchen, where her red kettle waited to whistle her homecoming. First thing she'd planned to do when she set her suitcase down after entering into her own house, purchased with careful money saved from decades of factory work, was brew herself a cuppa. She could almost taste her coming home cup of tea, the exact same blend that tastes altogether different on the tongue when brewed in Jamaica. Something to do with alkalinity, difference in the waters. 60 years she has lived in the motherland, arrived here with her mother and father as a babe in arms. And when they told her upon arrival what she traveled on was not a real British passport, they said she'd been needing proof she'd really been there for 60 years. Crazy amounts of receipts from every place she's ever lived in Britain, and no NHS, no form of benefits till it's all settled. And she's back in Mandeville. She pretends it's where she wants to be. And she no longer laughs and jokes when the market women say something for me in English. And then last night she saw another Windrush victim on TV who said that he and his family had decided that if he was deported, he'd carry enough sleeping pills with him to end it. Say something for me in English. And this is my last poem here. I thank you very much for allowing me in, even at this late stage. And I really I'm sorry I didn't have the chance to meet with all you lovely people, and maybe next time. It's called All Saints. I wonder what became of Alwyn Gilfillian. She was my friend in primary school, and other children said that she and I were both inclined to be cry. But I think Alwyn was even more prone than me to weep at the littlest thing. Her eyelids would tremble like moth's wings, and her big brown eyes, streaked with amber lights, like a type of tar or marble the boys played with, would brim. And she'd bite her lower lip and then commence the sobbing. For what? What you crying for, Alwyn? Other children would ask, and she'd just bawl some more. And sometimes, so she'd not feel alone, I'd just cry along with her. Why you crying, Alwyn? Maybe they'd say something, she'd said something like, teacher, look at me funny. And that boy long out him tongue after me, and that is nasty. And we both agree these were things to make a 9-year-old, finely tuned girl turn on the waterworks. I think about Alwyn Gilfillian these days when the world makes me weep. Specifically, the pandemic makes me weep. in general, the state of the world. But I hope Alwyn has thrived. I pray she's had a good life. May her eye water now fall as tears of joy. And Alwyn, if you happen to read this, please know I still think of you as my friend. Alwyn, named for a princess in a Welsh folk tale, your name means white footprint. And I weep when I recall how our school no longer exists. No more All Saints, Kingston, Jamaica, West Indies. The world. The world. Thank you.
Marvelous, marvelous.
Thank you. Such a lovely place to end. And you're right that Olwen means white footstep, of course. I'm speaking to you from Wales.
Oh, I read my friend Alwyn, whom I had not seen since I was 9 years old, found that poem online and got in touch with me.
Fantastic. I was wondering, I was hoping there would be a sequel when she...
Oh, yes, yes.
That's beautiful. Well, what an extraordinary reading.
Yes. So we had, two fine exponents of prose poetry before you started reading. I mean, I know Nathalie writes prose poems as well. And when you sent me your poems, a lot of them to me, when I was trying to see, this is the problematic thing when you start printing out poetry, the fonts change and the lineations change. But fortunately, since you have your stanza breaks or paragraph tabs in place, at least I know where the separators are. And when I first printed them out, I thought many of the poems were prose poems orientated. But then I also went back and looked at your document, and these are basically long line couplets.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this a little bit before, but do you have an issue, especially with technical constraints, when journals don't have the space for long lines and then it sort of gets cut in a different place? How do you sort of deal with that? I mean, C.K. Williams famously, of course, printed his books the other way around, and the poems wouldn't go from
not usually.
some of them. One of the books was actually from bottom to top, not all of them. How do you compensate for that when it comes to sort of putting it in print? Because like on the chat box, of course, they were coming across as 5-line poems, but they're actually couplets.
Well, you have little control over some of that once it's out of your hands, but I spend a lot of time and effort with my line breaks. So I'm trying not, I don't set out to say, a poem like this says something for me English. I would concede that maybe that's meant as a prose poem because the subject is so, it's like I was writing a newspaper account in some ways of the Windrush situation. But for the most part, I spent an enormous amount of time trying to make sure my line breaks mean something. And a lot of what is at the heart of my project is trying to write English in such a way that it is standard English, but to a Jamaican reader like Jeffrey Philp, who will understand just by virtue of where I break the lines or which two words I put beside each other. It has a whole other different meaning to a Jamaican reader.
Yeah.
So it's very hard for me when I see all that hard work that I may have put into a poem, just sort of, rearranged on the page. But I can see that there's very little I can do about it. I just hope that once, you read. I'm a painter by training. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how the poem looks on the page.
What is it about Caribbean poets who are also painters? So many of them.
I don't know. Well, Derek Walcott was a painter. Yes.
Yes.
Is it the light?
No, I don't know. It's just what you. I think, for example, I wanted to paint because it gave me my own space. I come from this huge family, and my elder sister is a writer, so I thought I could be a writer. So I'm a painter. So that was what I was doing. That's my way of making identifying myself in this huge family. So that's the only reason I'm a painter.
One of the things that I really loved, I've never heard you read before. Of course, I've read you and read you and read you, but I've never heard you read before. So thank you hugely. But was that tremendous sense of speed in your line? You know, that there is so much going on that, I mean, one is never allowed to say that a poet is intelligent. That's somehow regarded as a bad thing, but just this enormous sense, you know, isn't it? We have this strong anti-intellectual thing going on in our, but actually one can have emotional intelligence, but you have just the fierce speed of the things that you're observing and juxtaposing really blew me away. And maybe that has a relationship with the long line as well.
Probably, and because I honestly think that definition by Wordsworth, the one that is, you know, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. There's so much of that, because I think certainly for me, I take in everything that's around me all the time. I'm constantly filling up. And so when I'm overflowing, as he says, you tend to overflow, having absorbed all of this. There's just so much I want to tell you, because I've seen so much, I've taken in so much, and I don't know. I think a lot of writers are like that, aren't they? You kind of notice everything. I tend to notice everything around me, and also maybe that also has to do with coming from a big family where I was always just wanting to tell my side of the story, you know.
The act of seeing or noticing that you've mentioned, you know, ties up with at least three aspects of your life. You as a writer, then seeing as a painter, and then you as a reader, both you reading off the page to yourself other people's work, and then you actually reading out your own poem. And I very familiar with the diction that you read in, and the line breaks, even if it's not visible to others, say on the page, sonically you make it very clear how you indent or rise and fall.
I try.
So these three things coming together. How important is ekphrasis? Because Cassandra was reading poetry, which was, you know, very much influenced by that.
Well, I have certain poems that are definitely. I have a particular poem which it's called "Who Was the Mother of Jamaican Art," and it just talks about, you know, how enslaved women, when they had some of them, when they had children sold away from them, they'd make these little images of the children and hang them around their necks and feed, you know, when they went to eat, they'd symbolically offer this little thing, missing child, something to eat. And it sums up for me sort of what my whole, you know, obviously because I'm a painter, I have lots of ekphrastic poems, but that for me is what my project is, that sort of feeding that little child who represents the enslaved child who was taken away from us and our history. And I don't know if that answers your question at all, but when I think about ekphrastic poetry, I always kind of, that's my touchstone in a way. Because I do write about, and I write about Vincent van Gogh, for example, because like everybody else, you're fascinated by his life. But
I mean, what's cut away? I mean, you know, not just Van Gogh, but, you know, if you think of Turner's painting.
Yes.
I mean, that sort of brings in the whole tradition of Englishness and slavery. Yes. So vividly on the canvas.
Yes, he did that amazing poem of painting of the Zong.
Yes. Yes, and then David Daverdeen wrote a whole book, a long poem called Turner.
Yes,
wonderful poem, yeah.
And I think Marlene Orbese Phillips has some poems, set of poems about the Zong.
So we're coming to the end of our session, but one thing that ties all of us, many of us certainly, is our work as anthologists, as editors.
Yeah.
Each of the poets, I think, you know, we've all done, many of us have done. So I want to talk about that a little bit, because Cassandra has put co-edited two brilliant anthologies of prose poetry. She's doing another one, I think, of international prose poetry as well, that's coming out soon. Then, of course, Nathalie with Arabic women, and then the Northern anthology, which, you know, happy to be in. which really for the first time I felt went beyond England, America, Canada, and Australia. It really went beyond that space. And Lorna, so talk about your role as an editor, what you decide to put in, what you leave out. It's a very complex, complicated thing, but maybe we can start with Cassandra, because you went first, and then with Nathalie, and then we'll end with Lorna.
Or maybe I should talk about how many people hate you after you
Yes.
put an anthology together, right? I've never been into a room of poets before where they kind of divide themselves between those that got in and those that didn't get in. And you can get harassed a little bit when you're on panels too, you know, about how you made your choices. I like to be really clear in the introductions, if I can be, about what I was looking for and why I chose these particular prose poems perhaps over others. In the anthologies I've done in Australia, part of that has been people who've been quite dedicated to the form. So there's a lot of people that do a prose poem here or there, or have maybe one in a collection, but we also have a lot of prose poets who write, you know, whole collections of prose poetry, or much of their book is kind of devoted to that. So we wanted to kind of have that tradition very obvious. But, you know, we also wanted to show different kinds of prose poems. So some that were a little more narrative, some that were a little more neo-surreal. And so we talked about having a representative sample, as well as having the trajectory of having the development of the form. But my biggest thrill about it is there's way more women than men in our anthology. So I'm very happy about that. And we didn't count them as we went through. Once we'd put them together, we were having a bit of a look at the gender split, and we were wonderfully happy that there were so many strong women writers that we'd put in. So yeah.
Hey, Cassandra.
Nathalie?
Nathalie.
So I think for Poetry of Arab Women, it was, you know, there was nothing at the time that was translated into English and presented. And so for me, what was important is it was contemporary poets, and it had to be from every single Arab country, North Africa, the Levant, the Gulf, and also its diasporas writing in other languages. That was really important. And also during that time when I was editing this anthology, we didn't really communicate with email. So, you know, I was still dealing with fax, and, you know, there's a lot of stories there. It was much more challenging with the Norton anthology because, well, first of all, India and China alone, I mean, you can imagine them. There were so many poets writing in so many different languages. And then to have, you know, all of Southeast Asia, East Asia, Central Asia. It was very important for us to include Central Asia, which is often, you know, not in the conversation. But the problem was to find translators from there. So sometimes you'd have a Central Asian poet in exile in Sweden. And I mean, it was really something. And like Cassandra says, you know, it's difficult. The only thing you can do is find the balance between, you know, different aesthetics, languages. It's trying to find that balance, which is hard. But I can tell you that me and my co-editors, every poem we did not include, because we had a book of like 2,000 pages, okay? And so every poem we did not include was, we mourned. we had to like bury the, you know, not bury because the poem is still there, but it was really, really difficult. So it was just finding that balance and hopefully somehow succeeding, you know.
It was an interesting ploy because all three editors sort of introduced different sections. So that automatically lent a particular kind of signature to that, and the tonality as well. And just the fact that you're all very diverse, even though all the three editors are American poets at the end of the day. But, you know, Tina Chang being Chinese and you Palestinian, French, and Ravi Shankar being Indian and American, it just added that sort of polyphonic breadth to the whole thing. Yes. But yeah, I mean, you know, of course, we have lots of enemies. Everybody we can't publish is instantly unfortunately.
Everyone that you don't publish thinks that it was a personal decision and nothing to do with their work. And everyone that you do publish thinks that you had no choice in it at all. It was entirely their work.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, when can we distance text from friendship or text from just people? But that's not a question. One thing, Lorna, I want to ask you is because when we see African and Caribbean anthologies, the one problem I have when I see it, approach them mostly is the fact that they are, in a sense, in a silo. When we're talking about world English poetry, it really ought to have it as one arm of a larger leg. And it's something that we also have trouble with South Asian writing in English and so on, though it's becoming slowly more accepted. Tell us how that part sort of fits in, because there's also that sort of Creole element which gets in, which kind of complicates and makes things quite interesting.
First, let me say that I have not had a lot of experience as an editor, but I did put together an anthology of new poets as part of my tenure as the Poet Laureate of Jamaica. And that came out of a competition. I launched a Young Poets Prizes. And I was very much intending for that prize to, invite people from every corner of Jamaica. Very often, the arts are very, city-centered. But the competition was thrown out to people, on every side of the island. There was one prize for people from, one side of the island and another, and then for everybody. So we got a great range of entries of different voices. And I really was happy with what happened there, because I think there are some voices that we heard which we wouldn't normally have heard. And it was I very much wanted to introduce those new voices into Jamaican poetry, like one of the guys who won, for example, came from a little village near where my mother is from. And I mean, that's not why we chose him, but I mean, that's just a little place in Jamaica, and who would know that there was some little young poet there working away, So I think, but so I think certainly in Jamaica, there's a great range of voices and a lot of different experiences. There were poems from young people who lived in, sort of really hard areas where, they talk very factually about, gun violence and, hiding under the bed when things happened and things that I had not heard of, I wasn't familiar with those things. And okay, what I'm saying here is that depending on what the subject, what they're speaking about, the language is very often appropriate to that subject. There's sometimes the language is, but what we call, I guess, basilectic Creole, really hard Creole. Or they would speak the way I speak, which is a mixture of both English and Jamaican dialect. They would code switch depending on the subject. And I thought that was interesting. And I'm not answering a question except to say, I hope I'm making an appeal for people to just be more patient with understanding that kind of writing. Because, if Mark Twain was doing it, and that's all right. My example I always use is that we were taught to revere and to honor and to think as wonderful the poetry of Robert Burns, of Robbie Burns. And but then we were taught that Louise Bennett was not good, was not a poet, not doing the same thing as he was, which is ridiculous, So I think sometimes if we just a little patience, just a little, don't be so, if people would just approach it in a more relaxed way. There's a lot to get from those voices written in Creole. And I don't know if I'm explaining.
No.
Answering your question, but I think it's very much. Oh, just one last thing before I go on is that I found something like people in Germany, for example. A lot of readers in Germany are very relaxed about reading Jamaican Creole. Maybe that's because a lot of them, I think you speak, don't learn High German until you get to high school or something. But more than most other European, readers, I've found that people like in Germany are very, very happy to struggle, if they will, with Creole. And I'm appealing to others to give us the same break.
Well,
So
it's
editing is door opening, not door closing, which is a wonderful thing, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
If you can't read Robbie Burns, you can read Louise.
Yes.
Yes, and we brought in the whole idea of love and lyricism, and
Justice is a form of love, as Nathalie said, quoting Bell Hooks.
yes, and the whole idea of borderlessness and islands. I mean, Cassandra is from a huge island, and Lorna is from another island, and
Yes.
we are all in archipelagos. Really, at the end of it, that's what connects us. I mean, look at the screen right now; they're just mosaic tiles.
And
And
there's
this is
my
how-
beautiful friend Tom Lynch, who is also from an island. Where is he?
Oh, where
Hi,
is
Tom.
which island is that?
Yeah.
Yes. So on that note, I think we should
You're
wind
mute,
up.
Tom.
Yes.
Yes, thank
Thank
you
you.
so much, everybody, for an absolutely extraordinary afternoon. Well, sorry, it's afternoon here, evening, morning, wherever we are. What an extraordinary reading. I mean, 3 passionate protagonists with 3 different poetics and just such a rich experience. Thank you very much from me, Sudeep.
And likewise, Fiona and I've had such a lot of fun, putting all the series together, and it's been going on. And it's just a treat to come back and, reunite, not just for the 2 of us, because, I admire her poetry, there's a long friendship, but just to bring our friends on board. That's been a very enriching thing for at least me, that,
Yes.
Fiona's wide reading and my wide reading sort of meet with love and affection. So yes, thank you for flying the flag high, not just for poetry, for women's poetry, for polyphonic poetry, and bring your friends, recommend good people to us, and we'll have them on board. And thank you again very, very much.
Thank you again, everyone.
And this will be available on YouTube in a day or 2, so you can share it as well.
Yeah.
And many thanks again.
Okay.